Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Christy Loisel. I'll be your host for today's webinar. Our presentation today is Property Vulnerabilities, Understanding Hazards, Exposures, and Mitigation Principles. We will be taking questions at the end of today's call. However, you may submit your questions at any time via the questions panel. It's on the right side of your screen. If you don't see it, go ahead and click on that orange arrow to open it up. Look for the gray questions bar. Click on the right facing arrow to open it up. Type in your question and hit send. Our presenter today is Tim Leech. He is well qualified in property and casualty risk control consulting. He brings over 35 years of expertise in public entity, healthcare, tribal government and casinos, academia, hospitality, manufacturing, waste and trash haulers, and general industry. Tim holds a Bachelor of Science in Fire Protection and Safety Engineering from Oklahoma State University, as well as 2 Associates of Science degrees in engineering-related disciplines. He is also a certified safety professional and a licensed property and casualty insurance broker. In addition, Tim is a member in good standing with the Associate in Risk Management designation. I'd now like to turn the program over to Tim.
Well, good morning. Thank you all for taking time to spend with us on the webinar. I hope everybody's doing well, that you're safe amidst all this crazy things going on today. And so today what we've done is essentially the agenda for our presentation really is we're gonna have a case study. I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in general market conditions. What areas are loss drivers for property loss, and then we'll address key factors and how we might mitigate to either do one of 2 things, either reduce the possibility of something occurring or influencing the outcome once something happens, because we don't always have control over the events that occur in our lives, which we're all experiencing right now with the whole COVID issue. But to get started, Chris, we had a polling question. I wanted to get an idea of where people felt they're at with regard to property risk exposures.
Okay, I've launched the first question, so go ahead, put in your response. Where do you fall? I'll give you guys a few seconds to give your response, and then we'll close it up and share the responses with everyone. All right, we've got about 70% of you responding, not bad. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, so get your last minute responses in, and I'm going to share with everybody. Okay, so if you are one of those that says, I am not that confident, that's 8% of you. 67%, I am somewhat confident. 26% says I'm completely convinced that we manage this properly. So thank you all for participating. Appreciate that.
Well, great. Well, that's good to hear, because the whole concept of what we can do from a standpoint of risk control or loss control, if you will, as a consultant to clients, I don't really have the ability to control, and oftentimes you don't have the ability to control either. But we want to be confident in our approach. So if you're not confident, or wherever you fall on the spectrum, the whole idea here is that if we can continue to improve, because we all have areas that we can improve with regard to property and other areas of safety management, risk management, and loss control. So let's talk a little bit about the property market and what's going on. Let me just preface it with saying that, look, I'm not an analyst of the property market or financial analyst by any means. It doesn't fall within my expertise or within my preview with regard to responsibilities of what I do for our clients. However, I've been in the business not quite 35 years. I don't know where she came up with that, but not quite 35 years. As you can see, I look much younger as well. But what I do have is experience of going in markets, because they're cyclical with regard to insurance, and it wavers between a soft and a hard market. And up until I guess about 2018, 2017, there's a huge number of losses. I mean, it surpassed historically what insurance claims and related losses. But up until that point, we really have been in a soft market. And as you can see over the years, I think we go back to 2018, where we were seeing the 2018 average of about 5.6% in renewals with regard to premium. Today, we're experiencing somewhere between 12 and 13%. And what that does from an underwriting perspective is, underwriters get a little bit, they're very risk adverse oftentimes. And so as the market hardens and there's pressure on driving for additional cost and trying to do things to make sure they minimize or optimize their losses, they get very, not only does the market harden, but they put an increased emphasis on engineering controls within the companies. They're more selective about what they choose and who they write. And so it just really, it's a snowballing effect really that quite honestly, the employer, the insured, often bears that burden of what's going on. Now, within most of you, if not all of you, are probably in Alliance Property Insurance Program. I also want to mention that we, some of the examples and things that I'm presenting here, like the case study I'm going into right after this, they're not in our program, okay? But I think it still plays, and it's still relative to understand what's going on in the property market, because it is something that you're vulnerable to, and quite honestly, none of us have control over that. So, but just keep in mind is that I'll try to make sure and comment on that as well, that in many cases, and a lot of it has to do with the way that our program's underwritten and the philosophy around how we act as an advisor to our clients. So I personally think, not just because I'm with Alliant, but I personally think it's favorable for the client within a program with such as that we have, from the standpoint of how we approach the risk reduction and the underwriting aspect of that. I think it plays in your benefit. And kind of to that, I'll tell you a little bit about, this is a distribution center. I live in Southern California. It's a large retailer. You probably 90% of you, if you hadn't known, if I mentioned to you who they were, you would have heard of them or know of them or even shop there. But they have a couple distribution centers in Southern California, and they're like I mentioned before, they're not a program, they're not a Alliant program, property program, but we do broker their insurance. As you know, Alliant's very large, so we do much else outside the public entity space as well. But many of our public entities have distribution centers or warehouse and storage, and so there is some applicability. So they've been with another carrier that's a large engineering kind of centric carrier for about 5 years. They underwent loss control visits on at least on an annual basis. They had one large loss, one water claim recently from a burst pipe within the past year or so. But I'll tell you that while this is not a photo of their center, this is kind of, it represents, I mean, the place is immaculate and it's very clean, very well controlled. It's not aging. I think they did updates to their lease and fire protection systems, so on and forth, within the last 7-8 years. I think 2012 was when they moved into these facilities. So the condition was really well, and so they've been able to really take advantage of the soft market over the past 5+ years that they've been in. I think they had a multi-year contract as well, and their property insurance on about $160 million worth of an asset, that's physical property and contents, was about $200,000 a year. So you just do the math, and that's a pretty darn good deal. So everybody knew that, hey, they're taking advantage of this pricing opportunity. Well, partially probably because of the loss they had and because of what's going on in the marketplace, the carrier loss control, if you will, went out and just really hammered them with a bunch of recommendations where they felt that the system wasn't designed adequately to control fire. They addressed some human element systems, and we'll go into those a little bit. Well, and then they were kind enough to extend, to give them a non-renewal and a 2-month extension so they could get placed somewhere else. Well, What that did, it drives the markets crazy, right? Because everybody wants to know, well, hey, how come XYZ dropped you guys? And so, the report that had to be made to the carriers, and they basically, their next lowest cost of insurance was $1.7 million, so some 7 times that. Now that's really driven very much so by the hard market, and in order for them to even get this pricing, we might get some relief on this pricing. We had to go down the road of capital projects that are going to be very costly, with the thought that if they are able to do these things, and I'll go into some of the recommendations, these things, which are going to be hundreds of thousands of dollars in many cases, was there a return on investment, or do they just roll the dice and continue with the premium? So in an effort to get a premium relief, here's some of the requirements they had, and these are not actually, the funny thing is that they've had solid shelves. For example, they have high rack storage, which the sprinkler system, the water needs to flow through the shelf. So if you have solid shelving, that doesn't happen. And so, that was one of the requirements. Now that alone is just really upsets operation and extremely costly, though it's a qualified recommendation. The other one on here that is real critical, and that we're still kind of going back and forth with the carrier and with the contractor that the client is going to hire, is installation of draft curtains. That there's some differences of, I'd say, engineering opinion between the contractor who does this all the time and the carrier who's recommended they install them. And we just kind of have to try to navigate that, and hopefully they'll get some relief. And then some of the other ones are just very not as much capital consideration, so on and so forth, like maybe a sprinkler head here and there, or the seismic improvements there, which are earthquake bracing on a sprinkler system. They have them, they're all up to code, but this carrier has a higher level standard, which, as if you're not aware, you have kind of, and we'll talk a little bit about the balance, but you have local authorities, which we commonly refer to as authority having jurisdiction. They will adopt codes and standards that are applied to an organization. Well, an insurance carrier doesn't, they don't have to require that level, or they can require a higher level of standard in order to meet their underwriting qualifications. And that's exactly what's happened here with this client. Some of these recommendations are following the other carriers, and some of them are not. Some of them they're not as concerned with, say, seismic improvements, but they definitely are focused on the draft curtains and replacing the solid shelves. And then the other recommendations that came through are on human elements, and I think that's where probably the majority of people on this call come into, because most of us, from the standpoint, the engineering's already been done. The building's been built, the fire sprinkler systems, if you have them, are in place. All your controls are in place so much. So what happens is to bring in human elements, and that is things that we would do to make sure that systems are going to function the way they should in the event that they did have a fire. So a big one was flue space. So if you look between the racks that are vertical, you look through the racks, there's flue space in there that need to be maintained. Now the racks were separated properly, but they didn't even have any back stops that, so a forklift operator, if you will, the pallets would come together. So that, again, that obstructs water flow, which is a big, one of the main reasons why systems fail, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So that's a pretty extreme example of what can happen because of the market hardening. And while we don't have control over that, I think that there's vulnerabilities in recognizing these things that we're able to make sure that we put processes in place that we can satisfy not only just regulatory requirements and carrier requirements, but also satisfy that which we need to do to make sure that we're properly protected in the event of a loss, or preventing the loss from happening to start out with. So in addition to some of those, what I'm calling demographic or environmental type exposures, being say windstorm and those things that were really driving the market to kind of go crazy, you have these non-weather related property losses that need to be addressed. And that's going to be fire and smoke and causes of that, flood, water and mold, vandalism and theft. Certainly civil unrest of recent, the civil unrest of recent has also created an issue. So where I live in Orange County, we haven't had any issues with this, but doesn't mean that we wouldn't. We've had some not protests, but yeah, protests and some peaceful protests and things like that, but haven't experienced what maybe some of the other cities throughout the country have. But again, they lead to other issues, even from the small starts with vandalism, and that kind of stair steps up as you go. And we've seen that happen over and over, not just of recent, but in past years. So these are the main areas that we would look at that we would probably have a better control over. So it basically serves us well to understand, okay, what are the primary cause of these, and what is it that we can do to address them. So a little bit of my soapbox here is that I consistently and continuously try to strive for a continuous improvement model, which we've all seen through business continuous improvement. And really, if you look at the risk management improvement process, it's very much the same as what I've got illustrated here on the assess, select, monitor, and implement. So really, that becomes your program to success for a successful, in this case, property conservation program, with the bedrock of it really being the assessment process. And what happens very often is that what I've seen over the years, and I think that any of my team and other professionals and peers that we work with would probably agree with, is that though assessing the issue is paramount and it really does form the bedrock of your program, it's often the one that is overlooked. So everybody wants to, take the magic pill or have the quick fix oftentimes, where it's like, well, we can train or we can inspect this away, and that's not necessarily the case. There are critical elements to how we make improvement, but we really need to understand what the root of the issues are prior to selecting what our strategy is to address the issues, how we implement and monitor. And so what we do is that some of the things that I've identified as really being very critical to the process, and it really starts with the management and control. Risk transfer being insurance in this case, and we'll talk a little bit about that and the importance of having some general understanding, even if you're not involved in the procurement process. Some of the programs that we think that you should be reviewing, and then of course, where does inspection come in and what is it that we should be looking at? And then last but certainly not least is that particularly when we get into things like emergency action programs and business continuity programs, you really want to exercise your plan and run through it through mock events such as tabletop events. The fire drills is one that, again, that's exercising the plan, evaluating it, and then making adjustments as you need to. So again, these are all areas that we'll look into a little bit deeper as we get through the presentation here. So it becomes a balance. So we've talked about some of the exposures in general sense, what's driving the market, what carrier requirements are, what maybe local entities may require, and then your exposure. So you've got this balance that you really need to look at. So anytime you get to focusing simply on, let's say, regulatory compliance, you're going to miss the other things. So it really takes a balance of having a holistic understanding of all these areas. And the way another thing that gets missed is understanding how your operations work. From my perspective, one of the first things I want to understand is what are reporting responsibilities? What's the organization look like? Because that basically helps us to understand how we might work with our clients to drive an implementation of something. So, you may have some of the same components, but how we apply those are going to be different throughout the organization. And we'll get into that a little bit. But again, you want to take a balanced approach as you move forward with your pre-loss and post-loss mitigation efforts. So insurance, I think probably one of the things that I've seen, even professionally and when I've worked for other brokers and carriers, is someone not really understanding what role the insurance plays. Now, we all understand what role it plays, but how a different type of insurance could be addressed, could have an impact. And we're going to go into that a little bit, but just to kind of review for those of us on the line is that insurance is really a pooling concept. So essentially what you're doing is that you're trying to spread the exposure over a broad base, or a large number of insureds in this case, so that when you do have a loss, it doesn't wipe out your ability to pay that loss. So it's a contractual agreement with the insurance carrier, basically to guarantee that you'll be reimbursed for a covered loss in exchange for premium. We often refer to this as a transfer of risk. There's a difference. If you retain a large amount of self-insurance, if you will, or deductible, we all have experienced it in our own. If you have a auto, for example, and you have $1,000, $1,000 deductible versus say $100 deductible, and how does that impact you? Well, you can imagine an organization that now all of a sudden, because the market has changed, in order to get the premiums to an acceptable rate, they have to have funding, or they want to take on a larger amount of risk so that they're minimizing their outgo or their expense with regard to insurance. So, there's different financing mechanisms within insurance. So that's something that you should have an understanding of as you're approaching it, because if you don't understand what portion of risk is been transferred, or what the company is the organization in this case is going to retain internally, it helps for you to understand different maybe implementation strategies with regard to making sure that you're covered. And then you also have an issue of potentially having a bear or a gap in your insurance. So if something's not covered under a certain element of a loss. So with that, it's important that you sit down. If you have access to the insurance policies, wonderful, or if that's something that you're really into and you want to read them, that's great. But at minimum, you really should be sitting down. If you're in safety management and you're not in risk management, if you're a safety manager, you should be sitting down with your risk manager, because they should have a handle on, what areas or what keeps them up at night, what's their concern. And then conversely, if you're a risk manager and you have people in your organization that have safety management responsibilities, whether they report to you or not, there should be some conversation there to make sure that the efforts that they're making are not going to leave, say, an open gap, if you will. And we'll talk a little bit about business continuity. It's probably one of the areas that I would say most clients have some form of a program, but maybe it's not as holistic as it needs to be. So Christy, we have another question here, just a polling question with regard to insurance policies.
Okay, I've launched the second poll, so go ahead and respond whether you have a good understanding of your organization's insurance policies. So most definitely, somewhat, have never seen or discussed it, or it may not be an important function of what you do in your regular job. So go ahead, and we appreciate your participation. Thank you so much, and we'll give you a few seconds here to respond. Okay, good majority of you have responded. I'm going to go ahead and close the polling and share the results with everyone. Okay, so most definitely 33%, somewhat 42%, have never seen or discussed it, 17%. 8% of you said it was not important for my job function. So again, thank you all for participating. We appreciate the input.
Okay. Well, I'm not here to question anybody's abilities, but I think, or how much they know or don't know about the insurance program. But I know that with my staff, just internally, I want to make sure that we understand different components of the organization. Again, it just helps us do our job better. So let me just talk a little bit about why it might be important for you to understand. If it's not your job function, maybe you're in operations and that's just not something that you do with. So there may be a relationship or not. But let's talk about a situation here. So in the last few months, we've been going through COVID, what, 8 months now? It seems like it's been a lifetime, right? At the same time, it's not so, it's gone by fast. But, you know, so let's just do a hypothetical here. So we're approaching winter months in some areas of the country. You're further along that path. In Southern California, it's not as big of a deal. I mean, we worry a little bit about rain and maybe some mudslides if following wildfires in certain areas like Malibu, but those folks just rebuild their homes anyway. So, but let's say that we're going into winter here because of COVID. You've had a lot of, you've got some vacant buildings shut down. And let's say that management of the building management may not have a big, huge understanding of risk mitigation or what have you, and they choose to shut down the utilities and the facility, or they don't turn them back on. And as a result, through freezing temperature, you have a pipe burst. Well, I can tell you, running water in a building is extremely damaging. And we've all experienced what erosion can do just in the natural environment. Imagine what it can do to something man-made, or to building materials, if you will. So even worse so. So there can be extremely damaging, very costly. I know my home, we had a water leak a few years ago, and it wasn't even really visible. And I mean, just it was like it was tens of thousands of dollars to repair that, just from flooring and things like that. Well, if you are not knowing that, hey, look, we have a vacant building, there's conditions around our insurance policy that, let's say that it was the sprinkler leakage that happened, or a pipe burst because you didn't do an element of your term, what you're responsible to do to prevent loss in this case, there's a good chance that you may not have that covered. So in my case, if mine wouldn't have covered, it would have cost me somewhere upwards to about $50,000 out of my own pocket, which is quite a bit of money. And in a commercial or an industrial or commercial environment, it's going to be even more so. So this is just one element as to why you ought to be having that conversation if you have any responsibility over risk management and safety relative to your organization. So I would just encourage you that you have those conversations, or cruise through the policy to understand where what the type of financing it is. Are you retaining loss or not? Do you have unprotected assets? In this case, a vacant building, you have essentially have an unprotected asset. So if you don't meet those terms and conditions, as in this case, again, this is just generically pulled off the internet, but it's an example. and what are the limits. So just because they're insurance doesn't mean you're going to get full coverage for that asset. I didn't go into the other area, but even from the standpoint of appraisal, if you don't have if you've appraised the property or you haven't appraised the property and you don't want to do the appraisal or valuation because you know that rates have gone up over the past few years, again, it may limit the amount of remuneration that you'll get following a loss if you haven't got those values correct and the conditions and terms and conditions of your policy. So again, things to more risk management oriented, but it's good to have a basic understanding of these things. And we often work with great safety managers that really have a really good handle on this, and I think it makes them a better professional, if you will. So loss control, we mentioned a little bit about loss control increasing and being more stringent. Just as a general sense, like I said, underwriters get nervous, they tighten their belts, they increase more stringent engineering requirements as illustrated in my example, which again is ongoing right now. APIP has a little bit different philosophy. We really don't get sent out a lot to do underwriting surveys. Occasionally we do, but it never really comes back with a punitive recommendation. So we're really looked at by the underwriting team and Alliant from a brokerage standpoint as a service arm to help be an advisor and help our clients through the process. I really like that because I've always kind of gone with the understanding that, look, I'm not able really to control what goes on at the client, but if I can help influence them, mitigate and reduce losses and risk, guess what? That will reduce losses. Underwriters like lower losses. We all like lower losses. You're happy, we're happy, and it's really, you're in control that way. So, but we look at 4 primary things. We look at construction. You don't really have much, unless you're going into a building project. I would say you probably don't have a lot of influence that you're going to do with the construction. So that's more of an observe and report type thing. The occupancy, again, the occupancy is what it is. You want to make sure that the occupancy is proper for the constructions are proper for the occupancy and the protection for the right occupancy and so on and so forth. But those 2 items are pretty much there, and there's not much we're going to make a change. However, the exposures, that's where the analytics come in. Exposures such as the gas, the fuel supply here, and then the protection internally. Is the protection adequate? So understanding these things really helps put us in a position where we know what we can do from a prevention standpoint and what we can do from a protection standpoint. Is it adequate and our right processes in place? So what we're going to focus on from here on out in this presentation is really going to be talking about exposures and protections and programs over how we can mitigate either to prevent or to influence the outcome of a loss from a risk control standpoint. So our primary property exposures that we're dealing with, we mentioned before, we have the environment, which is, climate change, if you will, wildfire, wind, storms. We've noticed in the last, I don't know what number of years, an increase in hurricanes, an increase in windstorm and flooding. We've had Katrina, we've had, this is a picture of Hurricane Iniki, which I was in with my wife in the 90s. And it was devastating being on that island. It was quite the experience. But so we've got the environment to consider. We certainly can't control the environment, but again, we want to influence the outcome. So what is it that we need to have in place so that we can do that? Water damage from non-weather related incidents, is huge from a loss standpoint within the public entity space, within the APEP or the Alliant Property Insurance Program. Water damage far surpasses fire and smoke damage. So it's something to get your arms around, if you will. So again, If we can't reduce the risk, we want to look at what we do to help influence a more favorable outcome in the event that we do experience, a natural disaster of some sort or some act that is beyond our control within the organization. And the way, I'm sorry, Chris, do you want to do the next polling question?
Absolutely. Okay, so if you would, give us your response. My organization has defined responsibilities for the inspection, maintenance, and repair of the fire suppression system. Or maybe you don't have a fire suppression system, but you may have alarms, at least smoke alarms. So go ahead and give us your response. We'll give you a few seconds here to respond. Okay, pretty good response so far. Okay, I'm going to close up the polling and share all the responses with everyone. All right, 18% of you, no, we rely on a contractor to do the work. Yes, activities, you may have some activities that you do on your own, as well as having a contractor with the alarm and flow tests. 2%, no, we don't currently have a plan for the fire protection systems. And 20% of you were not quite sure. Again, thanks for participating, appreciate that.
Okay, the reason I asked this question is because what I find that often happens within clients we work with across the board is that, they basically, anything to do with a fire suppression system is basically they have a third party come in, they do the main drain test, they do fire pump tests, they do any kind of inspection, which is very limited, and so on and so forth. And the point being there is that, again, understanding what's going on in the organization is important. So for example, if you're doing the testing internally, that requires a certain, at least in California, and I think and definitely in many other states, because every state can be a different jurisdiction, have different jurisdictional requirements. There's certifications and things like that that you need to be able to qualify your maintenance people so they can do these types of things. And so we all, some of us, those of us that maybe have gone through any kind of business classes or whatever, understand that the management requires authority, responsibility, and accountability. And you remove any one of those pieces, you basically are going to compromise your management system. And I'll give you an example here. It was a California State University where we were asked to go out and do a survey of it. And, we came out and there was something in the neighborhood of close to 20 different, what I would call kind of fix-it type recommendations. So for example, hey, you need to have caps on your your FDCs. You need to have your control valves locked. You need to spring test your PIV, which is in the left-hand corner, or what have you done to test your gauges yet, because of certain requirements around that. So in other words, they didn't have a handle on how they're managing this, and it was really more of a reflection, not on the university, because it's a good university and all, but it's just a reflection on that they had not assigned management and control properly throughout the organization. And because of that, you can see where, in this case with fire protection and safety, their systems were compromised. And in a lot of cases here, the areas that they weren't taking care of are primary causes of why systems fail in the event of fire. So again, making sure that management control and that the people have the authority, responsibility, and people are accountable to it is assigned. And if you don't have that assigned, I don't care what your program or what your business management system is, whether it be safety or outside of safety, your success to that is gonna be compromised because of lack to do those things. So demographically, with regard to We said we're going to go into the environment. So again, we'll stay up top. We've got this, let's assume we have this properly management and control. Now let's take a look at something we really don't have control over. We don't have control over windstorm, earthquakes, flood, and for the most part, wildfire, whether or not we're in an area where there's that exposure. So much to say with social unrest, is there a history or area characteristics that you need to take into account? Is it an area where you're seeing a lot of vandalism and maybe theft and things of that nature? And it is an emerging risk with regard to the civil unrest. So you want to make sure that you look at holistically in your area what the demographics are, even though you can't prevent it. One of the first things that our team did when COVID shutdown started taking place was we took a step back and said, okay, what are our clients' needs going to be? What is it they're going to need? They're shut down now. What are they going to need when they go back into business? So the very first thing we created was a guide as to what are you going to do when the spike happens again, like what we're doing now. So that's really what you've got to look at. You can't control the wind, the earthquake, flood, wildfire. There's some things we can do to control COVID in my example here, but for the most part, there's still going to be another increase in exposures, especially with increased testing and such. So what is that we can do? So the best thing that we can do with regard to these areas, these 4 geological areas that I call them, is making sure that you have a business continuity plan in place. And if you have an element of business continuity plan, I think it's one of those areas that it requires a significant involvement within the organization, and without it, making sure that you can recover properly is really not going to be there. I'll give you a really quick example because I think I'm running up on the hour here. But I went to India earlier in the year and I left February 2nd. So a week or so before that, I went to get some things. We were going to be with tribals out of, kind of modern day stuff. And so there's a little bit of concern with cleanliness. So I went to go get hand sanitizer, as one of the items that I needed on my checklist. And guess what? I couldn't find it. And I went to Target. I'm like, you guys don't have any hand sanitizer? Where's your hand sanitizer? Oh, we sold out. It only dawned on me after that, because it was so early in the COVID thing, that people just basically rushed to the stores to get hand sanitizer, and you saw them rush to get toilet paper and so on and so forth. So what are you doing to prepare in the event if there's a massive area or a localized loss in your area that may limit supplies or abilities? I was in Thousand Oaks with a company in the early 90s, and what we had there was the earthquake that happened. Well, the organization I worked for, they basically commandeered an entire hotel that they were able to move employees that had non-livable situations at home. And, that was all pre-planning. So you really got to assign those determine what your goals and objectives are, and then build a plan around that, making sure that you're prepared as to not only what are you going to do in an event if you have some time, how are you going to act, during, and how are you going to recover from it. So BCP is critical. Water intrusion that's not weather related or from, say, a natural environment. Damage usually is going to be damaged windows, plumbing, and HVAC, maybe a crack in foundation. That's what was at my house, for example. Roof obviously is a big problem, and sprinkler leakage. So what are the elements that you could do with this? And this is generally your inspection processes and having a water intrusion plan. So do you have facility inspections? on an annual basis or no less? And are you regularly looking at your roof? What kind of maintenance do you have in place? Clogs, plumbing, for example. What is it that you're doing within your systems, your PM programs? Do you have materials in the event that let's say that there's a mad rush to get them because of an environment? If it was a flooding situation that was weather related, making sure that you had access to sand if you needed it and the things that you needed in order to prepare for the event. And then restoration. You know, I mean, I'm on the border of where the evacuations were in Southern California just a few weeks ago. Let's say there was a massive conflagration within the homes, who would I have to call to do restoration with my house? Help me clean up, help me get it by. You know, it's going to be a stand in line because I hadn't set anything up in advance. So set those contracts up and those types of things in advance to the plan so that it's a matter of process, and then activate or exercise your plan through mock training, if you will. Leading loss of cause of fires, it's not unknown really, is going to be hot work, permitting electrical, again, electrical machinery, vehicles, gases, and liquids. So hot work's one of the primary hot work in electrical, if we want to focus on that. If you looked at these losses that are listed in the bottom here, the Pier fire was a hot work issue, wildfire obviously was a wildfire issue, but the building under construction or renovation was a hot work issue. And if you look at even in New York from a new construction standpoint, they actually, as a result of a massive fire on a building under construction, I think it was a high rise under construction a few years ago, actually implemented regulation within the construction practices that hot work requirements would change in permitting with regard to fire watch on floors and things like that. So it can drive that significant type of change. But hot work, sprinkler impairment programs are going to be huge as well. And we'll get into that here in a second. But fire sprinklers are going to be your first line of defense. I guess you have the fire extinguishers there in the event that someone knows how to use them. However, you know, for the most part, your best line of defense is going to be your fire sprinklers. They operate effectively 88% of the time, and when they do, they're 96% effective. So it's important for us to understand why don't they operate effectively that 8 to 12% of the time. And the reason that most systems fail is because the system's shut off, the operating valve is shut off. So the supply valve, if you will. So your post indicator checks, your riser valves, things like that end up closed because of maybe maintenance and didn't get shut down. So we have sprinkler impairment processes in place, making sure the systems are locked in place. So these all require inspections to go forward. And, you know, typically the reason I asked that question earlier about contractors, because a lot of the things or some of the things that are required even locally with regard to not only just from a prevention standpoint, but from a compliance standpoint locally and from the insurance compliance, the contractor doesn't do. They'll come out and do a quarterly and an annual water flow test and alarm test, and typically that's it. They don't go test all your valves, they don't check all your gauges, they basically do a water flow test, and they may do depending on the frequency that is arranged. So it's important that you also as an organization have processes in place to inspect the components to make sure that they're functional and in the right positions and so on and so forth. So, and that's where human elements come in place. So that's going to be your fire protection program, inspection, test, and maintenance. That's all outlined in NFPA 25. Hot work permitting, sprinkler impairment, and facilities inspections. I noticed late today that when I'm preparing for this, one of the areas I didn't bring on here, but the best way to anticipate an electrical failure is infrared inspection or surveys. And infrared surveys, if you will, they basically identify hotspots in electrical components that, if not repaired, could result in a shutdown and or fire. So it's a really, really good process. So in critical operations, you want to make sure you have that included. And then we've got one polling question, Christy, and then one slide left. So should be able to finish within a minute after.
Okay, I've opened up the last poll. My organization needs the most improvement on the following. So go ahead, give your response, and I'll give you guys just a few seconds here. You can only choose one, so just pick the one that you think is the most in need. Okay, due to time, I'm going to kind of close this up a little early because I know we've got maybe some questions that are going to come in. So, okay, so responses are 33% assignment of responsibilities, 21% business continuity, 31% human element, and 15% water intrusion. Thanks for participating.
Yeah, so we're all across the board there. Just to address assignment of responsibilities, I have helped organizations have a significant impact on their losses, and the focus of this service that I provided was all on assigning responsibilities and implementing processes that they need to implement in place. And so that, I'd say that's really significant. BCP doesn't surprise me. But in closing, what I wanted to just get back to you is, again, I just want to reiterate that we're here as a service to assist you. We continuously try to improve and make sure that we're providing materials that are going to assist you as you look to improve your risk and protect life and safety in the organization that you work for. So we certainly have plenty of templates. We offer sprinkler impairment programs, hot work permitting. We have inspection templates and fact sheets. We're working on our website to hopefully get a lot of this information available, but it's as easy as contacting us or riskcontrol@alliant.com or calling the 888 number that we have on here. But again, the services we provide pretty much comprehensive. We do infrared surveys, on-site assessments. We can do engineering studies, plan reviews. We issue risk alerts. You all know about webinars. You're on this one. So any suggestions of areas that you want us to address that maybe we haven't, let us know. But again, in closing, Christy, we're here to help you all. And I guess if anybody wants to stay on a few minutes and we have questions, I apologize for going a couple minutes over, but we'll take those now, Christy, if there are any.
Okay, just a couple questions. How should I go about prioritizing which mitigation principles we should focus on first? Okay.
So a lot of that's going to be in your assessment process. And when we evaluate risk as far as prioritization, we look at typically severity first. So in this case, from a property perspective, you would look at what loss would potentially have the most devastating impact on the organization. And even though it may not be as frequent, and are you satisfied with the control measures you have in place? And after we look at severity, we look at frequency. So it's high frequency and high severity. You can even do like a quadrant chart and map out your exposures. There is a way that you can do it. We can maybe do a webinar on that sometime. But if it's high frequency, high severity, of course, you would focus on that first. If it's as the frequency gets lower, it would be lower on the prioritization scale, if you will. So that's basically the way you should approach doing it. And then if it means that the highest priority is BCP, make sure you're working with management to do that, because it's a big task. So.
Okay, and then does Alliant have any resources that can help get us started? You mentioned some of those. Was there something in particular?
Yeah, I mean, we have canvassed pretty much the whole spectrum of property and casualty, workers' compensation resources from the standpoint of programs and templates and so on and so forth. And typically what we do is if for some reason we don't have it and somebody makes a request for something, we'll either do the research to provide them with a resource, or we'll develop it ourselves to assist them. So I think the answer generally to your question is yes. They all call it come at no cost to the requester. So always tell our clients, never start with a white piece of paper. Always make sure you give us a call, because I'm sure we can at least cut down some of the time or help you out at some point along the way.
Okay, I don't have any further questions that have come in, but I do want to send out, here's some reminders to you all. Our next webinar is December 9th. It is on hazardous material storage. Again, that takes place December 9th. Want to remind you, you will receive an email today. So some of you I know reach out and email me, can I get a copy of the PowerPoint? Absolutely, if you need to. It is posted right now in the handout section if you're able to download it. Tim, if you want to advance the next slide, I believe it has our email address on the last one. Yeah, the email address as well as our phone number. So if you need to get in touch with us, but the email will include a link to today's recorded webinar. That will go out at 1 o'clock Pacific time today. So if you email me any earlier than that, I won't have it ready because it takes a time for it to go through its process to be ready for viewing. So again, you'll get the email. If you do want a copy of the PowerPoint and you're not able to download it, please contact me. I'm happy to send that to you. The Risk Control at Alliant email will get it to us, and we can help you out with that. I don't see any further questions that have come in. We want to thank you all for joining us. We do hope you'll be joining us again in December. Thank you, Tim, for a great presentation. As always, great information, and I know some of it may have been new to many of you. So thank you so much, and we hope to see you in December.
Thank you, folks. Have a nice Thanksgiving.